Learning and Development, narrated by Sulabtami, PHR, GPHR. So, learning and development. When you were asked to define what is learning and development, the other responses that you often receive is training, is coaching, leadership development. Yeah, you hear probably even safety training and so on. So depending on the individual that you interact with, the answers uh, you receive are sounds different, but at the end, learning and development is all about uh, enhancing the skill set and the capabilities of the human resources or human capital, as they would like to say, in an organization. So, as compared to the human resource management, when you engage in the with the HR professionals, yeah, and LinkedIn is surprisingly flooded with recruiters. I don't normally see a L&D specialist too often. I normally see the talent acquisition specialist. I believe that's the majority of the population. So regardless, when you ask any HR professional, what do you do? While the responses may vary because they might say, I do the legal compliance, I do the benefit administration, I do expatriation, I manage employee engagement, for example. The basic, the foundation, yeah, when you sum it all up, you can categorize probably into these three aspects, which is I hire, I develop, and I retain. Now, given the structural differences in every organization and the differences in corporate culture, the roles may be different. You might find a very specialized setting in one company. You may find a very generalized setting in one company. So, and some organization, typically the large organization, what they do is what I like about their learning and development approach or the philosophy is it is not treated in isolation. Like they don't have a separate training department. Yeah, they blend the learning and development outcomes into the job itself. So it is integrated with the job design. Now, one may wonder, isn't job design the responsibility of the talent acquisition person? Because he's supposed to know what skills are in demand. Yeah. So why does that have to do anything with learning and development? Here's why. Because when I say job design and talent acquisition, what they normally do is they make job description, and that is derived from the job analysis. We're not going to go deep into that. Is the study of the job, a very systematic study where you explore each and every duties and responsibility and create a job manual, probably a job specs and everything. So when you come to the job design, because the demand on the organization, it keeps on changing. People come, people leave, and you don't find a person who fits perfectly into the job profile of an organization. There may be some area where they lead, and there may be some areas that they lack. Yeah. So on the standardized job profile that an organization have, which differs from company to company because every company is unique in terms of its requirement, in terms of the services it's providing, in terms of the diversity they have. When I say diversity, I'm referring here to the intellectual diversity, not the surface level that is typically I'm not sure, and I don't find a word to phrase it too well. But anyways, so since the individual do not fit fully into the job profile that the company may need now and in the future, what the big companies normally do is they integrate the learning philosophy into the job design, as I've said. And how do they do that? Through several approaches, like job shadowing, where they let a person or the high potential employee work with a very senior experienced employee to see, okay, so if this is the career that I would like to develop myself on, this is what I will be doing in the next few years. Yeah, so they let job do the job shadowing with a senior employee or a more experienced employee on the same position. They do the pairing of the mentee mentors where they engage in discussions and they set collaborative goals on how they are going to develop the mentee in this case, or the individual who is being coached, and that is very specific and the job is specific. There's a difference between coaching and mentoring. So let's focus on the job design. There are several processes I mentioned, like the job simplification, job rotation, job swapping. Yeah, so these are blended, so you don't usually see a training department. Yeah, so it's not like a traditional classroom training where employees go and they learn the skills that they might need in the job. So moving on, as I've said, the information that I will be presenting in this video for our viewers to watch is from the perspective of HR generalist. Yeah, so I do not have a hands-on specialized knowledge on learning and development. However, I do possess the foundation. I do have a solid theoretical knowledge on L&D, so which I will try to impart on this video to the best of my capabilities. So let's move on. So introduction. Learning and development, as I've said, often referred to as HRD or an L&D. In some companies, they normally refer to as training and development. So the definition varies depending on the company. Now, what is covered in learning and development? Yeah. So as opposed to the psychomotor oriented curriculum, cognitive and affective is in demand in the present age. And why is that? If you evaluate the business context, yeah, so we can say it in other hand, one of the hypotheses that we can draw is L&D needs is relative to the external changes. You have an organization, that's your internal environment, but the external influences do also influence the need for L&D, for upskilling needs and so on. So yeah, that's the basic assumption we can derive at this stage. So, and why is that? During the Industrial Revolution, during the rise of steam engines and so on, the jobs that were in greater quantities were mostly manual driven. Yeah, you need manual inputs on that. You don't necessarily rely on your own intellectual capabilities at that time. So based on the prevailing situation during the Industrial Revolution, the training curriculum or the L&D curriculum were mostly motor oriented. It means relying on hands, probably, or more kinesthetic type that we will discuss. So as the business landscape evolved with the dawn of the information age, I'd say, or now some call it the knowledge-led economy, the need for cognitive-oriented curriculum expanded, as well as affective domain. Yeah, you see a lot of LinkedIn posts on EQ, empathy, and so on, or even the psychological safety. So that has a little bit to do, but but it has some overlap with the affective domain. Not largely, but yeah, to some extent. So anyways, so that is the introduction that I can share at this stage. Now, is learning needed? What constitutes a learning need? The general assumption and the rationale behind any L&D investment, because it is learning and development does not occur in a vacuum. Someone has to authorize the fund, the the time of the instructional designer, yeah, time of the trainer or the facilitator, and the time of the participants as well. So considering all that, someone has to sell a business case. And the rationale behind that business case is it will lead to a measurable business outcome, either performance, productivity, or profit. So the role of L&D specialist or an instructional designer or an HRD head is to align the activities towards the strategic outcome through, and it can even be a range of tactical needs that supports the overall strategy. What are the tactical needs? It can be, for example, increased customer satisfaction. So we train individuals on customer service. Yeah? It can be more reactive. For example, it can be like a safety training in response to the project need, for example, or as simple as inducting on an organizational SOP. That might be very unique from the standard that is set by the industry. So yeah, and the strategic initiative, as I've mentioned, from the learning and development perspective, are the leadership development, is the succession planning that is long term, that has uh, use of significance to the accomplishment of the goals of the organization long term. Yeah, it's required for business success, business continuity. Now, where are the learning needs derived from? As I've told you, in this video, I'll be sharing it from the perspective of HR generalist. Yeah. So based on my observation over the years, in last 6 years in Qatar, working in IFM, private security, and manpower supply, I noticed that the learning needs are much more reactive and tactical as opposed to strategic. Yeah. So it is commonly derived from the qualitative feedback from peers, or the supervisor will say, hey, my employee will be needing a training on XYZ. They will not necessarily, do a proper evaluation, and maybe the observation will not be correct, or maybe the sample, or let's say the employees that they will recommend do not actually need training. So there are a lot of biases and a lot of other factors that the L&D individual needs to, I would say, review before they move on directly to designing a training curriculum in response. So it's much more reactive. Someone will come up and say, based on my observation, the individual needs some training on, let's say, a particular software. Yeah. So that is how it's based on the mostly the qualitative aspect rather than strategic, or maybe an operational need, as I mentioned earlier, like in specific project, they need a specific training requirements, for example, like fire safety and so on. So and and this is the one thing that have surprised me too. This is during crisis hiring. Let's say a very important employee has to put their resignation. Yeah, because of the Article 49 of the labor law, it grants the right to an individual to resign. So it is not like you have to serve your employment for a definite period of time. That is normally governed by the definite clause. Here we have indefinite clause, so that provides the right. So let's say an employee using that particular privilege they have under the law puts their resignation. Now, the crisis management begins because you do not have a successor for that particular position. So you resort to an external source. And as I have mentioned in the beginning, the individuals do not typically fit into the job profile because of all the unique requirements. In some company, if you ask an HR professional, what do you do? Aside from drawing it into the basic assumption, they hire, they develop and retain. The list of duties they will provide will be not similar to other organizations because of the differences in uh, the infrastructure, because of the difference in stakeholder expectations, and so on. So every company is different. Now, when an employee resigns, yeah, how do you bring an individual and train them on the job? Will that be possible? So these are some of the considerations that an organization needs to make. So, or I would not say this is the sole responsibility of the L&D. This is a shared responsibility that the organization needs to be serious about. So, yeah. Now, aside from the crisis management approach or the reactive approach to L&D, the best approach to derive the learning need is from the ADDIE model. We can use the ADDIE model. An ADDIE model is one of the most popular, I would say, a model for which that is widely used on instructional design. It's mainly used to make any kind of training, curriculum and so on. And the ADDIE stands for Assessment, Design, Develop, Implement, and Evaluate. And the most important phase, aside from the evaluation, which is often left out, is the analysis phase. Because if you have a wrong starting point, your training goals will never support or never realize its outcome contributing to the business objective. And it will result in a failed business outcome, and you will not have future support from the line managers or even the executives you authorized for the training. So, analysis. And when you draw a need analysis, the L&D should not be all about L&D itself. You need to have some awareness, I would say, as CIPD describes commercial acumen, ethical acumen, and so on. But here, the business operational lens is really necessary, because if you do not know what is going on the operation end of the business, there is no use. Even if you deliver a world-class program, for example, you take a sample and they say, hey, it has already been a year and we haven't delivered them the customer service training, only later to find out that the division is going to shut down in the next 3 months, and the learning will not be really necessary because they're going to be laid off. So you need a, like, I would say, a vertical and horizontal integration. This is how the L&D needs to be positioned. You need to know that my efforts are not being duplicated. For example, on the performance management and from the employee relations, where they do the disciplinary hearings along with the line managers, and you identify some of the performance improvement plans. Yeah, so that is often done in overlap in conjunction with the L&D. Now, if an L&D wants to do that in isolation, they might be missing out that, hey, the line manager team or the project team is already doing that in the form of on-the-job training. In the classroom training or hiring an external service provider is not needed. So it needs to be done. So communication is important in short. So learning needs are derived from a range of inputs, like your inputs. Yeah, look at the performance appraisal sheets. You look at the overall performance. You use both quantitative and qualitative analysis to draw on your learning needs. L&D design and consideration. While the findings of the need assessment, now you have the need figured out. Yeah, okay, I need to deliver these three key skills to this employee so they can be able to perform the job, or they can be able to handle XYZ job when there is a job enlargement, when we are in downsizing. Yeah, or they can cover someone while they are on leave, and so on. So yeah, I need to train X, or maybe it's a legal requirement like the OSA normally has. Yeah, so while the need dictates the appropriate design, like in some cases, when you draw out the need, you need to consider, hey, is there some accommodation that we need to offer? For example, for disability, yeah, and also in not only disability and the other protected characteristics, but also when do I deliver this training? Do I do it during working hours or do I during off the work? Because if you do it off the work, it might send a signal that this training is not really necessary. And they tend to associate it with classroom training instead of workshop. So they are going to withdraw. So the findings dictates the appropriate design. It also provides the development of training program due to the difference in the individual capabilities, because the learning curve is different. Every individual, as I've said, they don't fit into the job profile, but their skill set is different, because unlike the classroom training, when you deliver any sort of L&D, uh, when you invest any L&D resources in a team, in a large group, you need to be aware that the individuals that you need to train or upskill, some of the areas that you're going to deliver, they already know. So there is an overlap. However, there might be some cases where some of the participants are not aware on those aspects. So you need to consider the both end. If I'm delivering, this employee is going to withdraw because they are already familiar with these areas. However, they're not so strong in this area. So what is the right approach that I need to consider on the design and the development? Yeah, will I be designing it in uh, auditory format, a visual format, or a kinesthetic format? So the concept of VAC applies here. Now, because the concept of VAC, the instructional designer needs to have a solid understanding on this, so they can determine which approach will be more effective and more efficient and will achieve the business objectives. The other consideration for the modern L&D specialist is to have at least a foundational awareness of the culture and why is culture necessary in learning and development. I want you to Google Gert Hofstad national culture. And if you do your work properly, and if you want to supplement that knowledge, you'll come across another cultural model from the Franz Trompenaar. I'm not sure if I pronounced that right, but Franz Trompenaar. He critiqued the original work done by Gert Hofstad that was done in isolation, and I would not say isolation, but the sample size have been critiqued because it was done in IBM, a high-tech firm, yeah. So yeah, and the dimensions that each of these, both of the research have explored are different. There is only overlap on one dimension, I believe, individualism and collectivism. So why is the understanding of culture important? One of the things you'll realize when you look up the cultural model is power distance, the concept of power distance, the concept of uncertainty avoidance. So in an uncertainty avoidance culture, where they do not tolerate risk, they don't have a thick skin, I would say, for ambiguity, yeah? They want a very structured curriculum. They want the instructional designer to tell them, okay, we're going to learn XYZ and I'm going to deliver XYZ, and it actually happens in the book. In the low uncertainty avoidance culture, however, the participants are more receptive to the change in curriculum or the free flow. Yeah, it is very, I would say, inductive in nature. We start from the specific, we go to general, we engage in the uh, participants discussion, and we do it flexibly. There is a flexibility, is what I'm trying to say. And the power distance. The power distance is very important because it also has to do something with the structural design. Why? Because in a high power distance culture, the individual assume that my top management or my line manager is expected to know what I need to learn. In a low power distance, there is more freedom, there is more employee involvement, there is more downward communication. So you will often see participants uh, giving feedback saying, hey, this was not what I wanted to learn. I wanted to learn XYZ. So a lot of the range of the stakeholders you need to engage and the methods you need to employ on your design and delivery will be quite different. And you need to accommodate those differences. This is why you need to have some knowledge on the cultural model. So the other question is now you have done your need assessment, you have consider what I'm going to design, and you have started to develop the material. I'm not going to be discussing in the copyright infringement because most of the copyright laws, it expires at the border. It doesn't apply overseas, and it is done differently. So I'm not going to go over that, as well as because the copyright, the expiration, is different. So I'm not going to go over on that because it has to do with the developmental phase. Now, you have designed and you have developed, now you want to measure. Since I have delivered the training, I've delivered the knowledge requirement. How do I measure it? Yeah, I've implemented it. Now, how do I evaluate it? Can this be measured? Well, there are several HR metrics that determines the impact of learning on an organizational outcome. And L&D is often associated with engagement and empowerment because when there is a difference, and the typical HR professional I meet cannot differentiate employee empowerment and engagement. Engagement refers to how loyal I am, how committed I am to the job, not the company. Yeah. And empowerment means I have more autonomy to do my job. And for me to be provided autonomy, or it's very common in decentralized, but even in centralized structure, there is some degree of autonomy provided to the certain levels of employees. Yeah, it comes along with the position. Now, for me to be able to uh, adopt a laissez-faire approach in this case, yeah, I will simply assign you and I will leave you at your own discretion to perform your job. But you need to be competent to do that. So the level of employee engagement and empowerment is affected indeed by the L&D because if I am competent in my job, I will feel more committed to the job, and thus the engagement rises. And thus, if I am confident in my ability to do my job without any supervision, and I feel there is a lot of autonomy here and no like micromanagement, for example, which Theory X manager tends to do, yes, I am empowered as well. So those are the approaches, like, and it's basically based on the surveys, internal surveys that dictates the level of engagement and empowerment. So those are the metrics, and the other metrics is the turnover rate. And during the exit interviews, mostly some of the rate scales are there because I was not provided with learning and development opportunities. I was not provided any growth opportunities in the organization. So those will also help you measure if the learning actually delivered to the business outcomes. And why is that important? Because if you have a competent employee or if you have a high turnover rate, that impacts your business performance through your lost productivity. So, which is why those metrics are also usually mixed with L&D. However, I'm going to present another. This is one of the most popular form of uh, a model, I would say, that is used to measure the effectiveness of any instructional design and delivery, and that is called Kirkpatrick evaluation training evaluation model. It's by Donald Kirkpatrick. He proposed a model that says a learning can be evaluated in four phases: reaction, learning, behavior, and results. And if you analyze the job descriptions that you not typically find online for the L&D positions, you will see the term. I want you to focus on the term evaluate. And you'll probably see some of the responsibilities in the L&D job description is evaluate uh, managerial effectiveness, evaluate, I would say something like that. And basically what he's saying is make employees happy in most cases. It doesn't work like that. It's important, but it's not the entire. It shouldn't be. It's not. I don't mean it's not. It shouldn't be the entire outcome of the L&D investments because reaction is typically measured, and it's the most easiest to measure, by the way. As we move up the pyramid, it becomes more complex to measure and demonstrate. So the reaction is, how did you feel about the training program? If you have ever been in a training program, right after the training, you'll probably be provided a smiley seat form where there is low to high. So there is a lot of areas that they normally survey, yeah, that questionnaire where you can rate, okay, I like the training environment, probably I like the meals that was provided, I like to interact with my colleagues, and there is a scale that they normally measure. So, and they how this is the most easiest to quantitatively derive our findings from because we simply take the number and put it in an Excel sheet or probably pivot tables, scatter plots, bar graphs, anyways. So it's very easier to measure. Now, the most difficult one is the results phase. And the reason being is the results takes time to actually materialize in the workplace. when someone walks out of the training center, you don't see an immediate impact. Yeah. And there is a lot of other confounding variables in the work environment, or I would say experimental settings, that influences the outcome. And we are going to discuss those areas on the behavioral science section, which is coming up shortly. So, as I mentioned, first is the reaction phase. And the second, which is, did you like the train? What did you enjoy the most? What did you enjoy the least? Or so on. And we move on to the learning phase. This is normally done by a pre-test, post-test, or you test on what you deliver during the training. You get the responses of the participants, and you duplicate the same testing with those who didn't receive the training. And this is normally called control group. And you evaluate the results. If those who were in the training program, the scores are higher than those who haven't been, then yes, there is some learning that occurred, or maybe the training did add value, at least in terms of the learning aspect. Now, some learning are focused on the behavior. And why is that? Because one of the sources that we derive our learning needs from, going back to the introduction part, as I've said, not only the qualitative feedback, it is through critical incidents. During crisis, for example, how well the individual cope, how resilient are they with changes? Yeah, do they panic so badly that they are not even able to do the job properly? So those things, and also the field review. You see someone performing in the job, yeah, the way they interact with the other colleagues and all, even though they are technically competent, yeah, those areas are measured in the behavior aspect. So after training, you can see the performance improvements on the site on, because if you're familiar with some events, then you are likely to be more calm in occurrence of that event. Yeah, there's a response to being surprised and I would say panicked. So that is the behavior aspect, and also sometimes the nervousness and from the personality dimension, I would say neuroticism. And this is required for managerial candidates or high potential candidates. To be able to control the EQ is one of the most important qualities of a manager. At least this is what I've been told. So some of the learning outcomes could be improvement in uh, how you handle stress or negative situation. How do you handle negative feedbacks? Yeah, it can be even those. So anyways, those are the behavior and the results. And results is normally determined in terms of the ROI. Do we see any changes in the business performance in the last 6 months after the training have been provided? Do we see any significant improvement from the salespeople after we delivered the sales training, or we put any training, any CRM software, and we did train them on that? Yeah. So, anyways, so this model, Kirkpatrick training effectiveness or evaluation model, can be used to measure the learning. Now, the most classic answer in the field of L&D is who is responsible for learning in organization? And this, I would like to call it the L&D dilemma. Yeah, who is responsible for L&D? And initially, when I was exploring for the CIPD level qualification, I found out that there are two specializations you can take for level 7: learning and development and human resource management. And my first impression was, I do not know, since I do not have the specialist or specialized knowledge on the L&D, I do not know who is responsible. Instead, I do have a foundational knowledge that I've described. So, and I interacted with a lot of my peers. What do you think on this particular question? Who is responsible for learning in your organization? And the responses were surprisingly, I would say, diverse. Some would say it's my boss' responsibility to ensure that the learning occurs. Some would say it is my responsibility, of course, because I'm in charge of my career. Some would say no, it's the division responsibility. Yeah. So there is anyway, this can be categorized into two areas: the employee self or the organization. And you have to control for the responses, because in many cases you receive two different responses from the same individuals. So it can be quite, although easier to do it, but to consolidate the data into the right fields can be quite challenging because of the differences in inputs uh, on this particular question. And I would like to ask you, who is responsible for learning in your organization? Is it the employee or is it the organization? And based on my exposure to a lot of scholar resources, I've gone through the journals, peer-reviewed journals, and it's worth noting that the arguments can be derived on the both ends. Yeah, there is a reasonable evidence that is available that says it's the employee's responsibility. And other evidence are also available that says it's the organizational responsibility. So the general rule of thumb that I believe is also accepted, but I would like to say on this video that at least I have reasoned conclusion to, based on my, I would say, unhealthy amount of research, is who needs the training? Do the employee need the training, or do organization need the training the most? And you get the answer to that. And this also needs to be adapted to the structural context, because as I mentioned earlier, the L&D the L&D specialist or the instructional designer needs to be aware of the cultural context and the structural context, because the power distance influences your structural context. So it is more likely to be more centralized in command and control, so the information flows downwards, yeah, instead of flowing upward. I believe I mixed up the upward and downward communication earlier, but moving on. Behavioral science. So as I mentioned earlier, the instructional designer, because as I mentioned, even though the learning have occurred, for it to successfully materialize in the workplace, there are so many variables that is affecting the outcome. So why understanding behavioral science is important? Let's discuss. The knowledge of behavioral science overlap with nearly all the professions since it involves human motivation. And this becomes particularly important for the L&D specialist and the instructional designer because it affects the outcome. For example, an individual who is intrinsically motivated will learn faster, will learn better, will produce better results post-training as compared to the ones who are extrinsically motivated. Yeah. And there are theories like Vroom's expectancy that supports that. It basically says that employees, they learn best, or the participant learns best when they are told the material importance. So a participant that is walking out of the training programs, if they truly believe that this is going to add value in the career, within the company or within the industry outside, yeah, they are going to pay more attention during the training. They are going to apply it right away in the job so that they can improve and enhance their skill set, so they can feel better about themselves. Yeah, that's the self-esteem. So we'll come to that on the Maslow hierarchy of needs of Maslow pyramid. Now, the other factor that influences is the supervisor's response to the individual. Now, if the instructional designer communicates the need and the importance of acquiring a certain skill set that they are going to learn in the classroom or at the job or any other forms of the design, for example, if it is done through e-learning, for example, the individual will likely withdraw if they get responses from the line manager or the executive who determines their appraisal coming year. If, for example, they hear a statement like that training is not necessarily important, that is not actually required for you to move up on this position. The individual receiving the training will not be fully committed. However, if they hear the other responses like, I see you have enrolled in this training and this was a good training, or I would like you to enroll in XYZ because other position in your career ladder is going to need those skill sets. Be more likely motivated to achieve that particular or to refine their skill set in that particular domain. So it's also the positive reinforcement. So I would like you to check BF Skinner. There is reinforcers and there is punishment. Yeah, reinforcers increase the behavior. There are positive and negative, and the reduction or the elimination or the punishment that decrease the behavior. So positive reinforcers are needed. So there is a little bit of extrinsic motivation, like from receiving those words from the supervisors or the executives, as well as there is an intrinsic motivation that comes once the individual masters the particular skill set. Yeah, like I'm competent in my job, I feel empowered, I'm more engaged, and so on, which I'm reverting back to my earlier statements. Now, despite them being told the material importance, I'm citing Bloom's expectancy here. And despite them receiving positive encouragement and the affirmation from their supervisors or the line managers that, yep, I do acknowledge what the training designer or the manager said is right. It is in fact indeed needed in your career advancement. Now, both of those reinforcers are present. However, there are other barriers because analyzing every of both of this from the lens of Maslow's pyramid, I would like you to check Abrams Maslow motivation pyramid, yeah, or hierarchy of need. There are 5 layers to it, and the foundation starts with the physiological need. So, and the theory postulates that for you to move up the pyramid, yeah, for you to move, probably the likely outcome will be the social need or the self-esteem or the self-actualization that is in the higher order. For you to achieve that, the below needs must be satisfied. So the bottom physiological need, second start with, third start with social needs, fourth layer of pyramid is the self-esteem, and the fifth is self-actualization. So it becomes different in terms of complexity for the external party, in this case, the organization, to instill, to satisfy those needs. Yeah. So let's say an organization is delivering a world-class training, and the supervisor or the line manager communicates yes, and about the training, uh, I would say instructional designer or the L&D specialist reinforces the importance of the material. If there is a salary delay, for example, or they're not getting paid enough, you will not probably be able to capitalize on the outcome that from the skills the particular participant is going to acquire, because the physiological need has not been met yet. So the individual is not going to deliver their 100%. So physiological need must be met, psychological security need must be met, then social need, and then the self-esteem. Yeah. So these are the factors that the instruction designer needs to be aware of. So in any experimentation setting, this have been replicated, by the way, and you can test these 3 motivational theories: Bloom's expectancy, I'm sorry, V.F. Skinner theory of operant conditioning, and Maslow hierarchy. If the L&D specialists have this knowledge, they have the holistic understanding of the human motivation, yeah, at least to a degree when it comes to uh, imparting knowledge or being able to successfully motivate the participants to learn and to apply the skills they on the workplace. So, conclusively, this is the summary that I can share on the area or the domain of L&D. So this is my theoretical understanding. This is my how I lay out conceptually on what I know of the L&D domain. So it often is confused with human resource development because it is human resource development, And when you ask someone in an organization, yep, this is one of the things I failed to address. Who is responsible for learning in your organization? And the most common response in one of the organization was, is the HR responsibility. So I would like you to check with your colleagues, with your HR, and yeah, and find this information for yourself. And if you can share that information to me as well. I'm available on LinkedIn by the name Sulab Thami. The name is available on the screen. And this video, if you're watching it in YouTube, you can comment down in the section below, on the comment section below. So thank you for your time. This video was probably long, but I did try to compress and to elaborate some of the section that I myself found difficult when I was starting to digest the learning and development module for my PHR and SPHR preparation. So I appreciate the time.